If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who didn't believe in the supernatural, etc. What experience did you have that changed your view? A buddy got separated from the rest of his patrol in a swamp. It was a training mission, but still not a great situation, at night. After wandering around for a while and becoming thoroughly lost, he ran into 3 dudes in the darkness. Thinking they were part of one of our sister units that were also out that night, he asked where our platoon was. They pointed him our way, and he wandered up less than 5 minutes later. I asked where he'd been, and he told me the story. The only thing was, and I confirmed this with the patrol leader, that we were the last element in the movement, and no one should have been where the 3 men were. I found out later that 3 soldiers died in those swamps in the 90s on a similar mission, and ever since then, multiple soldiers lost and alone in those swamps have encountered 3 soldiers who've guided them back to their comrades. At our house growing up, we had those intercom systems. There's one in every room, so you could talk to people throughout the house. The only thing is that they were old and really worked. They could play the radio, which was cool, but we couldn't use them to talk to each other. My mom told me she remembers being in the basement with my sister and me and hearing the intercom turn on. She could hear a little static and then a very deep voice laughing. There was no one else home at the time. It wasn't the creepiest thing she had experienced there, but it still freaked her out, but she just played it cool and stayed with us downstairs until my dad got home. Another time, my parents heard wailing coming from the downstairs of that same house. The way it was set up, their bedroom was on the top floor, and my sister and I were on the bottom floor by the basement living room, etc. They could hear this wailing coming from directly below their room, so right next to my sister's room and also mine. She said the wailing just sounded so mournful that it was really disturbing. So my dad went downstairs to check on us girls, and she remembers that as she could hear my dad moving through the house, the closer he got to where the source of the noise was, the quieter it got. By the time he reached our rooms, it was gone. Both my sister and I were fast asleep in our beds. Growing up there and being freaked out by the downstairs all the time and then hearing these stories really made me believe in something else. That house had a weird energy. I had an experience a few years ago that gives me goosebumps whenever I think about it. I lived in Australia for a few years a while back. Not long after I'd moved there, a couple of my ex-girlfriend's friends invited me to one of their friends' BBQs. With the house being fairly outside the city and me living in the city center, the hosts offered to put me up for the night, and I accepted since I had no idea where I actually was location-wise. The bed they had set up for me was like a floor bed situated in the kitchen, dining, and conservatory areas. It was a decent-sized house. So I'm lying in this bed, asleep, and I get woken by this noise. I can only describe it as sounding like a stone or pebble bouncing several times. Like a tat-tat-tat noise. Something is being thrown and skipping along the floor. I woke up slightly disoriented and confused, waking in a strange environment, and I hear this noise again and realize that facing the bottom of my bed is an open door. My goosebumps have just kicked in while I type. That door leads immediately to another door, facing to the left, that's ajar, and I think it leads to a room or closet. I wasn't brave enough to properly look. I hear the noise again and realize it's coming from that room or closet. The noise was repetitive but different each time. Anyway, I suddenly started to become really scared, a genuine fear. I lie there for what seems like an age, listening to this tat-tat-tat. Tat-tat-tat-tat every minute or so. I eventually build up the courage to jump up, and I run to the ajar door, shut it, and pull the bolt across it, then shut the open door and dive back into bed. I'm lying there, adrenaline going, and I'm starting to calm down a bit, and out of nowhere I hear this noise. My goosebumps just went wild. Ha! The bolt on the inner door just snapped open, and I hear the door creak as it opens ajar again. A few seconds of silence and tat-tat-tat. Probably the closest I've even been to a heart attack. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, and I politely refused to hang around the next day. I was walking at 10 p.m. at night in a park that had a forest trail with some friends to ghost hunt. We were a group of about 10 people? Anyway, I kept hearing footsteps behind me and near us, and nobody was there. I was in the back of the group since no one wanted to be there, you know, human shields and all. So I was more in the open, trailing behind a bit with a partner, when, out of nowhere, I heard a loud, blood-curdling scream. It sounded like a girl screaming bloody murder. It surprised me because I didn't expect it, and I jumped on the spot. I glanced at the scaredy cat of the group, no reaction. I glanced at my partner and the group, all had no reactions. So I just shook it off, but then I heard children laughing and more footsteps away from us in the direction I heard the scream. Nobody was there. After that, we reached a dead end, turned back, and left the trail. I asked my friends if they heard the scream, and they all gave me a blank look. What scream? One of them asked, so I told them and confirmed that no one else heard it. A few years later, I decided to look up the park, and it turns out a girl was shot and killed in that park. My condolences to that girl. Also, there have been reports of other people hearing children at night as well, even though there are no children outside past curfew. One night I was driving home from my then girlfriend's house. I was crossing a bridge when I saw the figure of a man standing at the edge. It was around 1 or 2 in the morning, but I didn't really think too much of it. I veered over to give him plenty of room, and he turned towards me. His skin was pure white, and when his eyes locked onto mine, I felt a horrible feeling of terror sweep over my body. He jumped off the bridge, and I saw a white streak fly away from where he jumped. I drive over that same bridge every time I'm home from college, and I've never seen him or felt the same feeling since. I've told this story to a couple people, and a few have also told me they experienced weird shit in that same area. I don't normally believe in anything supernatural, but I don't have any rational explanation for what I know I saw and felt. When I was 19, I moved to Vancouver with an on-again, off-again boyfriend. The boyfriend had a history of dabbling in Satanism, and some really creepy things happened during the time we were together, but the one that still gives me chills is the book. I had been regularly visiting a used bookstore in the neighborhood, and the owner had taken a strange interest in me. He would follow me around the store and make conversation, much of which was about a group he was part of that, according to him, had an interest in white magic. I thought he was weird but harmless, and I didn't think much of it when he started telling me I was very powerful and should meet his group. I mostly thought he was just strange and maybe hitting on me in a weird old man kind of way. One day, he gave me a book. He told me the book was very important and powerful and would change my life, but he strongly warned me that I must never let it fall into anyone else's hands because the kind of power cannot be trusted to just anyone. Soon after, I came home from work one day and found that my sometimes boyfriend was gone, as were all of his belongings. He had drawn a pentagram in blood on the bathroom floor for some reason, and the book was missing. Maybe a week or 2 after that, I was visiting the bookstore, and the owner asked me if I was enjoying the book. When I told him it had been stolen, he freaked out. He was pacing and frantic, screaming at me that I never should have let the book get into anyone else's hands. I found the whole thing very unsettling and never returned to the bookstore. Shortly after that, the boyfriend showed up again at my door with the book in hand. He gave it to me and said I was told I shouldn't have taken this. To this day, 20 years later, I have no idea what the hell that was all about. Just for a better understanding of my surroundings, I'm from Kentucky. Lots of wooded area. I used to not believe that there was unknown stuff in the woods. I thought maybe Bigfoot could be real, but I severely doubted it. After this happened, I knew there was something unknown out there. I had just bought my first AR-15 style rifle, a Ruger AR-556, for anyone who cares, and bought a 60-round drum magazine for it at Gander Mountain while they were going out of business because, why the duck not? Reading up on the drums, I read they were amazing and rarely had any issues at all. This will be important later. A few days after I got it, I finally decided to take it out for a test drive and sight in my gun a little better. Here's where everything went to shit. As I said above, Kentucky is very wooded. 3/4 of the land I lived on was just thick woods. There was a main path for driving our gator and a few small paths our cows had made in the woods. I decided to walk along our creek, which had a small path half cleared by our cows. At the end of the path is a big field where our cows graze and where I sight in guns when the cows aren't there. As soon as I crossed the fence to go to the field, I instantly felt like I was being closely watched. I brushed it off because I've walked back there 1,000 times before and never been bothered by anything. So, I keep walking and ignore the feeling of being watched, but at the same time, I'm aware of the feeling. I know I feel like I'm being watched, but I wasn't giving it any noticeable attention. The walk to the field along the creek is a very short one, maybe 2 minutes at a slow pace. The further I walked, the more intense the feeling got, like I was getting closer to whatever was watching me. About halfway there, the feeling got so intense that I couldn't ignore it anymore. The drum magazine I had with me was unloaded, so I stopped and started loading it. I only brought 20 rounds with me because I was just going to sight in my gun, and 20 should have been plenty. So, now I'm stopped, paying extremely close attention to what's going on around me, and loading my magazine. The exact moment I started putting rounds in the drum, I smelled something dead, like it had been dead for a while and rotting in the sun. I started looking around, and right behind me was what was left of a possum. It was torn to pieces. It was almost like it was placed there for me to find. The only thing was that it looked like it had been dead for maybe a day at most, and what I was smelling seemed like it was far more decomposed. This obviously didn't sit well with me, so I double-timed it on the magazine loading. I guess I should have taken the dead possum as a last chance to turn around. I decided to keep going. I had never had any problems back there before, so I assumed my brain was just being paranoid. I was almost in the field when I saw it. I was at the end of the creek, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. Just as I was nearing the end of the creek and the edge of the woods, I heard a splash in the water. Me being on edge, I immediately turned towards the noise, gun ready but no round in the chamber. Walking down the creek away from me was something I will never forget. At least 8 feet tall, probably taller. Very skinny. Imagine a grown man who weighs 120 pounds. Now stretch him out to be 8 feet tall, but his body width stays the same. Very long arms, and it walked on 2 legs. Skin stretched tightly across its body. It made no noise, aside from the splash when it stepped in the creek, while it walked. It also had a very weird walk, almost like a waddle but taking large steps. But that could have been because it was on a muddy creek bank. It was also a light brown color, almost like the color of a deer. That's all I can remember about it right now. I will edit it later if I remember anything else. Now I know why I felt like I was being watched. Magazine loaded, bolt ready to send a round into the chamber. Remember what I said about the magazine being extremely reliable? I press the bolt release on the gun to chamber a round just in case this monstrous thing decides to attack. I did not intend on striking first. The round gets stuck somehow and doesn't even budge out of the magazine. I had never used that magazine before, so it didn't fail from heavy use. A bolt closing from a gun has enough force to break your finger, so why didn't this magazine work? My only guess is that something had something to do with it. The magazine never worked right again, and I had to return it to Magpul. Needless to say, I didn't tell them this happened, I just told them the magazine failed several times. Anyway, back to the thing. Gun jammed on the first round, which is usually the easiest. The thing made it out of there without running or making a noise. I had just enough exposure to it to get the details I provided about it. Now, for assumptions. It happened in late May last year. I still have the emails from Magpul regarding the drum, so I'm using those as references because, after this, I needed something reliable. As for what the creature was, me and a friend who knows more about this stuff than I do have decided it could have been a ducking Wendigo. The reason we think Wendigo is because everything I described matches them near perfectly. I had read that they are incredibly thin and tall, have a stench of death that follows them everywhere, which explains the smell of the possum, are very fast, can be several colors, light brown included, and that they sometimes violently kill other animals to scare humans, again, the possum. The only thing that we couldn't come up with was its behavior. Why am I still alive? Wendigos are supposed to be incredibly aggressive. Aside from watching me, it did nothing. It didn't try to attack or confront me, it ran from me like it was scared or trying to draw me where it wanted me. This being said, I have never had another encounter with it. I have gone to the same field, taking the same path, expecting to be watched, but have not gotten that feeling of being watched as strongly as that day. Something was out there, and you can't convince me otherwise. I've tried to trick myself into thinking I'm being watched out there, but there's still no comparison between that day and today. We have a ton of back roads near our town in Pennsylvania that my friends and I love exploring because they just take you to random old farms or hidden trails in the forest. We have done this a lot in our past time together. So my 2 friends leave my boyfriend's house. I stayed because I was spending the night with him, and they decide to go exploring. They go down a road they've never seen before and drive on it for about 15 minutes until they come across a house. The house is white and deserted, except for the light of a fridge in the kitchen that they can see through the window. Creepy, but they continue on. They go further down the road and come to the end. A house is in front of them, with a garage on the side. The garage door is open, and no lights are on. It's already creepy enough, and they decide to turn around when they see something. A dog walks out of the garage and just stares at the car. They told me it had a very human-like face. I've asked them about this separately, years apart. They didn't know what they saw, but they said that this creature had the face of a human. Body of a dog, face of a human. Maybe it was a bulldog or a pit bull? Something with a human-like face? No. Face of a human. Too sentient looking. They're screaming and freaking out because they can hardly process what they're looking at. They actually went back a second time because they were in shock about the whole thing. The same thing happens, creatures walk out of the garage and calmly stare at them. They turned the car around and sped away. Another weird thing is that as they were speeding away, terrified, they remembered passing an old pickup truck on the road. About 5 minutes later, going in the exact same direction, they passed the exact same truck again. The road was one way and surrounded by trees. Maybe it was a bizarre coincidence, but it looked like the exact same truck, parked in the exact same place. My experiences began fairly young. I've always seen and heard things. I've had a few dreams come true. It always freaks out my mom when I know someone has died. The scariest thing that ever happened was as a teenager. My friend proclaimed herself a white witch and studied all about it. She brought her Ouija board over once, and we were messing around with it. We contacted someone who said he was my cousin. I had an interesting time but didn't really put a lot of faith in it. I've seen how those things were debunked. Anyway, this entity said it was going to play a joke on my mom, and the board went dead for a few minutes. When it came back, we asked what happened, and the response was, "You will see." About a minute later, my mom came into my bedroom and asked me what I wanted. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about. Mom said, "I was in the laundry room, and when I turned around, you were standing there smiling. I asked what you wanted, but you never said anything. I went back to the laundry, and when I looked up again, you were gone." I had never left my room. This thing made it look like me and my mom interacted with it. I told my friend not to bring that board back. She put it in a box like a cedar chest or hope chest and piled stuff on the lid. When I came over, we could hear the lid trying to open. Eventually, we ceremoniously burned it. This is one my grandma used to tell about one of her aunts. They lived in Laos during the Secret War. Her aunt started talking with one of the American soldiers, and he started learning basic Hmong. After some time, though, he stopped showing up. The basic consensus was that he was dead, but she kept waiting for him. When things got really bad and the bombs started dropping, they fled to the caves for shelter. One night, as everyone is sleeping, she hears a familiar voice. It's the soldier. He's mumbling in a very broken Hmong, "I'm back for you," over and over again. Her eyes are still closed until she feels something reach out and grab her shoulder and slowly move down to her hand. When it reached her hand, she said it wasn't a human hand at all, but like a large animal paw. She briefly opened her eyes to see a dark figure, clearly not human, standing over her. Then she heard her aunt get up. Something was said, but she couldn't make out what it was. The figure then left, and the aunt followed. This was still in the middle of the night, mind you. The aunt was never seen again. The story is that the dead soldier came back to take her with him. Or something else imitated him in order to take her. A girl I knew for a few years and was very good friends with passed away in a car accident. A few days later, I have a dream that she's standing in the center of the road, and I'm barreling towards her. I run into her, but then she appears in the seat beside me. She forces my head towards her abdomen. Where her stomach would be, there's a large mouth. The teeth are made of broken glass and sharp metal. She keeps saying, "Shh, shh." I wake up from the dream, and I'm still hearing, "Shh." I look at the foot of my bed, and she's standing in my room. She walks through my door and into the hallway. I follow her. She walks down the hallway and vanishes through the front door of the house. I didn't realize it at the time, but my dad was on the couch. He asked me if I was okay and if the flickering lights were what woke me up. He didn't see her, and I never noticed the lights flickering. This happened about 8 or so years ago around Thanksgiving at my grandma's house. Everyone was asleep except for me. The only people in the house were my grandparents, my mom, my brother, and me. No one else. This is key. I was on the computer because I couldn't sleep. I turned on a small TV to watch Adult Swim while I browsed the internet. At around 4:30, I started getting a chill up my spine, and I heard some children laugh. Distinctly the voices of a little girl and boy. I know I'm all by myself as far as being awake, so I turned to look at the TV, and it was in the middle of an Inuyasha fight sequence, so there's no way the laughter was coming from that. I checked the computer's sound settings, and I had every possible output muted, so it wasn't that either. I sat there confused for a few moments while the giggles of the two children played in the background. I figured maybe the radio in the kitchen was on. It was digital, so maybe it just came on for some reason or it had a timer. I got up, and I kid you not, as I was walking to the door, with each step, the laughter grew louder. From giggling to guffaws to hard laughter. Once the guffaws started, I started to hear a baby cry as well. What's going through my mind now is, what the duck kind of radio show is this? And I just took 3 steps. Nowhere near the door. I took a few more steps, and the laughter turned hysterical, if not maniacal. The baby's cries turned to screams and wails, as if it were in pain. I was trembling and terrified with each step I took to the doorway, but my mind was on autopilot. I needed to get out of there and across the hall to my mom, who surely would help me and notice the weird sounds too. The last couple of steps increased the laughter and crying to an almost deafening decibel. It was like I was at a concert and the speakers were directly in my ears, blasting noise. It was painful and scared the snot out of me. I took all the courage I had, and as soon as I reached the doorway, I was going to sprint. I started to run, but then something shoved me. I felt these hands on my chest push me back into the room with enough force to throw me off balance. The crying and laughter stopped as soon as I was back in the room. This all happened within 20 to 30 seconds, but it felt like 10 minutes. I was so scared that I cried and slept in the tiny armchair before my grandma came in the room and made me sleep in her bed downstairs. There is an infamous haunted covered bridge where I grew up. It has been said that if you stop halfway on the bridge, shut the engine off, hit the lights, and roll down your windows, you can hear the moaning and groaning of the dead coming from the creek that's beneath the wooden structure. It has been said that many bodies have been found in pieces in the water. Another story is that the trees that lead up to the bridge were used for hangings, and then the bodies would be dumped into the creek. Flash forward to the night before Halloween 2006, and I'm joyriding with a few friends. One of us dares Darren, the only one with a license in our friend group at the time, to go through the covered bridge and stop halfway. Darren was scared, but after a round of calling him a chicken, he agreed to go. It's a fairly cold night. We go down the back road and approach the road to the covered bridge. We begin driving through the tree-guided road, and after about a minute of driving through the thick fog, we come to the bridge. We stop just before it and roll down the windows. The wind begins to rustle through the trees and starts howling through the darkness of the bridge. We slowly creep onto the bridge, and it feels as if the bridge is just going to give way to the creek below, sending us with it. We make it halfway, kill the car, and turn on the lights. We're sitting there in the darkness, all scared, and waiting for the moaning and groaning to start. We begin to hear what sounds like large objects being slammed into the water below us. Over and over again, large splashing sounds are heard. At this point, Darren has had enough, and Jake and Chris had to physically stop Darren from letting out a yell so we could continue to listen to what was happening. Suddenly a large gust of wind howls through the bridge, and we hear faint groans and pleas for help. We all look at each other with fear and excitement all rolled into one. Darren immediately turns on the lights, slams the car into reverse, and we're out of the bridge in seconds. He whips the car around, and we begin speeding back down the tree-guided road. We're all looking back and just expecting to see something, anything, come charging out from the covered bridge that would explain those sounds. Before we can think a second longer, Darren slams on the brakes and begins panicking. He's speaking gibberish at this point, and we're all trying to calm him down. He begins frantically looking back. He finally strings together a sentence and tells us all to look back behind us. We all look back and see a limp body hanging from the tree. Our first reaction to seeing this is to completely dismiss it and think it's some kind of prank. Darren isn't having any of that. Jake gets out of the car and begins to slowly walk up to it. It takes Jake no longer than 10 seconds before he nopes the duck back into the car, yelling at Darren to drive. Darren floors it out of there, and as we're driving away, I ask Jake what he saw. Jake says that when he got close enough, he saw that the body was as real as it could get. He saw steam rising off of it, and the way the neck was contorted looked so real. He could see a lifeless body sway in the wind and hear the tree struggle to hold onto the weight that was pulling on its branch. We all got back to Darren's house and tried to erase the night from our minds. The next morning I called my uncle. He was starting his normal route as a cop a few towns over, and asked if there had been any reports of a hanging or bodies found near the covered bridge. Of course, the answer was no, and we all felt at ease with the situation. We still get together every year during the stretch of Halloween week, typically the 26th to the 1st of November. One of us will always bring up this night and the true fear that has been instilled in us. We can't explain it, but it's a force that continues to scare us to the bone. We have yet to even gather up enough courage to go back and experience it all again. I personally do not believe in the paranormal, but some of the experiences I had at my dad's house as a teenager sometimes make me think otherwise. My whole family experienced plenty of strange happenings at this place, but the most jarring occurred when I was 17 years old. I rarely visited my dad's, but whenever I did make that hour-long trip into the nothingness of Wisconsin, I was always uneasy about what I might see or hear that night. The house had some very unique features that always struck me as strange, the most notable being a small crawl space in my bedroom that connected to my sister's bedroom adjacent to mine. Both sides of this crawl space were fitted with a small door. We never really knew what the purpose of the tunnel was, as it was far too small to use for storage and even too cramped for a grown adult to comfortably navigate. Anyway, this particular night when I went to bed, I heard some very strange noises, almost like a faint whimper or crying. I didn't think much of this because it wasn't uncommon for coyotes to come by the house at night looking to prey on our poor barn cats. The night went on, and the noises came and went. Struggling to sleep, I went downstairs to grab a glass of water from the kitchen. When I came back into my room, I noticed that the door to the crawl space was now ajar and the whimpering had stopped. More than a little startled at this point, I quickly got back into bed and tried my best to fall asleep. Eventually I was able to fall back asleep, but I was later awakened when I felt a sinking feeling at the foot of my bed. I assumed that I must have left my bedroom door cracked and that one of the house cats had climbed on my bed. I closed my eyes and tried to fall back asleep, but I was forced awake by the sound of a slamming door. I opened my eyes and noticed that the door to the crawl space had been slammed shut. Then I quickly glanced at the foot of my bed and saw the outline of a large figure staring at me from the end of my bed. The figure was all black with bright, white eyes. I got out of bed as fast as I could and ran downstairs. I spent the rest of the night awake on the couch. I still don't know what I saw or if it was even real. I was ready to chalk it up to sleep paralysis, but my sister told me the next morning that she was also woken up by the sound of the crawl space door slamming. That was one of the last times I spent the night there. And if that wasn't bad enough, 5 years later my dad and stepmom decided to add an extension to the house, and when they were digging the foundation for the extension, they uncovered gravestones from the 1800s. No, thank you. There's a bridge near where I grew up in Bumduck, Tennessee that is notorious for screaming at people at night. The screams aren't audible to the houses nearby, and supposedly you have to sit on the actual bridge to hear them at all, though I personally haven't tested it or anything. The common explanation is that it's a bobcat that lives under the bridge, but people have checked with dogs and such and never found signs of any. Well, some friends and I had heard this story for years as we were growing up but never tested it. So one night, after a few beers, we get the notion that we're going to go test the thing. So 5 drunk guys pile into a beat-up car, and we drive down and park on the bridge. This is 1:30 a.m., and it's dead silent. We sat there for a good 45 minutes, and nothing happened. We had the windows down and had started debating whether or not it was all bullshit when the scream happened. We had the lights off, and there was a moon, so you could see pretty well, and there for sure wasn't anything outside the car, but it was ducking loud, and it sounded just like a woman with particularly powerful lungs having her skin ripped off right outside the window on the rear passenger side that faced off the edge of the bridge. Now I've heard bobcats in heat while hunting, and they do like a scream kind of thing. It's hard to describe, but they do it in little, repeating bursts. This was a good 3 to 4 second extended scream at incredible volume. We tore out of there like a demon was chasing us. A couple of miles down the road, we finally stopped and actually processed what happened. My adrenaline was going so badly, and I was so scared that I was just shaking uncontrollably. One of my friends had actually pissed himself, which I'd never seen anyone actually do. One friend immediately left the car and vomited. To give what I think was a good frame of reference to how actually terrifying this was, my friend whose car we were in wasn't even mad at the friend that pissed all over his seat. It was insane. To this day, I have no explanation for it. Some 20 years ago, I was living near the Canadian border alone in a rented log cabin. It used to be part of a fishing resort and had been renovated since it was built in the early part of the century. The cabin was approximately half a mile from the nearest neighbor and 15 miles from the nearest town, so I had gotten used to isolation fairly early on. At the time, I was working PM shifts at a resort 25 miles away and wouldn't typically get home until well after midnight. On this particular night, I had gotten home, put on pajamas, and gone into the kitchen area to wash dishes. I was standing in front of the sink, looking out the window onto the woods, when directly behind me, just above the height of my head, there was the sound of a man's whistling. Just 2 notes, and then nothing. I positively froze. I looked into the reflection of the window in front of me and saw nothing. Very quietly, I wrapped my hand around a totally inadequate knife that was in the sudsy water and turned around. There was nothing there except for my 2 cats sitting by the wall, looking directly into the air behind me, where the whistling had come from. This kicked off many extremely odd experiences in that cabin that continued until I moved out some 6 months later, but that one was by far the most shocking just because it was completely unexpected. I spent a great deal of time alone in isolated locations, but since that evening I have thought long and hard about what it means to be a woman alone in the woods from a safety perspective. When I was about 12 or 13, my best friend and I rode our bikes and discovered this small, hidden graveyard. It was backed by some railroad tracks and under big, buzzing power lines, far from any houses. There was barbed wire around the graveyard, and the tombstones were mainly faded, but we could see some of the dates from the late 1800s. We stopped and took pictures for fun but didn't think much of it. Well, for about 2 years after that, I'd wake up every night between 3 and 3:30 a.m. because I'd hear papers rustling in my room. Then, I'd hear what sounded like footsteps coming up the stairs and stopping once they reached the foot of my bed. I peeked a few times and didn't see anything. I started sleeping with the TV on to block it out. Eventually, I woke up one night because I heard what sounded like dozens of people whispering loudly in my ear and screaming for my mom. I told my parents about it, and my religious mom threw holy water around the house. Then my dad bought flowers and told us to bring them to the graveyard. It stopped after that. I always thought that maybe I just had night terrors or something or imagined it. Recently, I'm now 25, I mentioned this to my dad again, and he said he'd also heard footsteps at night but thought I was just getting some water or something at 3 a.m. spoopy. My grandmother lives in an old Victorian house that has many flights of creaky stairs. On multiple occasions, I swear to God, I have seen a young boy running up and down these stairs. The creepiest experience with this was when I was house sitting for her. One night at about 3 a.m., I woke up and went down the stairs to the kitchen to get a glass of water. I never bothered to switch on any of the lights in the hallway and walked straight into the kitchen, where I did switch on a light. I poured myself a glass of water when, all of a sudden, I got a really horrible feeling of terror. I then began to hear the stairs start creaking, almost like someone was walking down them. This terrified me, as I knew there was no one else in the house. So after a few minutes of freaking out, I mustered up the courage and walked out of the kitchen. As I looked at the stairs, I saw a smiling child's face staring directly at me. I froze in fear, and after a few seconds, it had completely disappeared. After seeing this, I turned all of the lights on in the house, watched TV, and never went to sleep that night. Another strange thing that happened was when I and one of my cousins were staying at the house with my grandmother when we were in our teens. My grandmother was out shopping when, really out of the blue, my cousin decided to go for a walk. This was strange as she never really wanted to go on walks. I brushed this off and continued to do whatever I was doing when, again, just like I previously discussed, I got a sudden feeling of dread and terror. This time the feeling was much stronger. It was so strong and disturbing that I had an extreme urge to get out of the house. I felt as if I was being forced out of the house. I caught up to my cousin and explained what happened, and she said she had the exact same feeling as me. We were both terrified and nearly in tears. We didn't go back to the house for a couple of hours. This happened when I was about 12 years old. I was living with my mom in the house of her then boyfriend. One night, I'm sleeping, but I wake up, I have no idea what time it was, and I see something beside my bed. It's kind of crouching and looks like a person, and I realize that it looks like my mom, and it's dressed in the clothes she would wear when she was going to bed, so a tank top and shorts. I guess the thing realized I was awake? And looked towards me. I didn't understand what was going on, so I pulled the covers over my head. After about a minute, I peek out, and that thing is still crouching beside my bed, but this time it's holding the lamp from my bedside table, and it looks like it's offering it to me. Like when someone is holding something out to you and kind of motions it towards you to take it, I guess? My 12-year-old ass is like, "Duck this is not my mom," and I start screaming. I see the thing's head whip towards the bedroom door, and I think I closed my eyes for a second. I hear a thud, and then the ceiling light gets turned on, and mom's boyfriend is in the middle of my room looking panicked, shortly followed by mom, who is looking very tired and confused. I definitely saw him enter first and her follow. The lamp was on the floor, and the crouching thing that looked like my mom was gone. I still don't know to this day what that was, and it's been over 10 years. There was a graveyard that had a gravestone that looked like it would glow at a certain angle. This was a popular local thing. It would be common to show up at the graveyard at night and have a bunch of people there to see it. One night, while myself and another friend were there, some sketchy guy, who looked homeless, said that the ghost of the girl who was buried at the glowing gravestone had been seen recently. My friend and I both looked at each other like whatever, but we stayed because we had nothing better to do. About 10 minutes later, a family shows up, husband, wife, and 3 kids, all under the age of 10-ish. They're standing next to us. We're all waiting for something to happen. We're standing about 20 feet away from the gravestone, and there are no lights around, so it's dark. I then think I see a small shadow figure, blacker than the darkness around us, walking around the gravestone. I don't say a word to anyone. It then looks like it stopped and knelt down beside the gravestone. As soon as this happens, the creepy homeless guy leans over to me and very quietly says, "Do you see it kneeling down?" At this point, I freak out. Not more than 30 seconds later, the mother of the family skips over to the gravestone and starts to skip around it. We're all in shock. Her kids are bawling their eyes out because they're totally creeped out. Her husband keeps calling her name. She just continues to skip around. She stops, walks over back to where her family is standing, and acts like nothing ever happened. She finally sort of snaps out of it, and her husband asks what the heck that was all about, and she claims she has no recollection of what happened. At this time, myself and my friend are completely freaked out and have decided it's time to get the hell out of there. I definitely saw a shadow. I don't know what to think about that mother skipping around. I wouldn't think she would freak her kids out to the point of crying just to prank a few people. When I was 16, I woke up on a Wednesday night about 2 a.m. and there was a ghostly figure walking up the middle of my bedroom floor. I froze and reached for the light on my bedside locker, but it wouldn't switch on. So as a coping mechanism, I decided the only thing I could do was hide under the duvet and hope it all went away. After about 10 minutes, I peek out and notice the light is now on. The room is empty, and I managed not to urinate on the sheets, which is always a good thing. The female that was in my room was dressed in black, and I could make the outline of her face out. She spoke softly, saying, "Don't mind me." That didn't settle me in any way. In fact, I think it made it worse. So fast forward to that Saturday night. I had friends over, and I had a new phone, which at the time was pretty cool because it had a camera on it. We were taking pictures and messing about. 2 days later, I noticed in one of the photos that this lady was sitting in a chair at my kitchen table, right behind where my friend was sitting. I freaked out. It was her, and I thought I was losing my mind. For about a week after this, I noticed strange things in the house, like the cupboards in the kitchen all being open when I walked in, and the front door being unlocked when I knew I had locked it. I had terrible nightmares this week too. I finally bottled it up and told my parents what was happening. Once I told my parents everything and showed them the photo, they took me to our parish priest, who, to my surprise, immediately came to our house with us. He opened the front and back doors and said prayers as he blessed the house and said a few words. An interesting thing he said was about the area I live in. He said he has seen so many strange and frightening things on the hill, which he can't speak about, but claimed what happened to me was minor compared to what others had endured. I asked more questions until he finally told me what had been happening and why. We live on a mountainside above a small town that has become very built up with houses and activity. About 3 miles from this group of houses is a castle that is around 3,000 years old and is notorious for its hauntings and cruel history. I was informed that anyone killed in the castle would have been buried on the land where my house is, and there is a lot of activity and a lot of lost souls in the area. The hill I live on is called the Bridal Lonan, which is based in Warrenpoint, County Down, Northern Ireland. The castle is called Narrow Water Castle. Feel free to look into the history of the castle and why the hill has its name. From the stories I have heard, the hill is called the Bridal Lonan because, while trying to get away on horseback from the castle with his new bride, a knight had his head severed off and the bride was able to still guide the horse along the hills alone, hence the Bridal Lonan. My family has a very old cottage in the mountains, where I like to spend time every summer. Last summer, something really scary happened. Evening, fast midnight, I'm downstairs in my room and I'm reading a book. My grandparents are upstairs, they are probably sleeping. As I said, this cottage is very old and has thin walls, so sometimes you can hear what you really don't want to hear. For example, my grandparents wake up often through the night because they need to go pee, but when they go to the bathroom, the whole cottage shakes. Especially when they are on stairs, everyone else hears their steps. So I'm in bed and reading my book when I suddenly hear some weird noise upstairs, near the staircase. First one short shake, and then steps. But which steps? It sounds like kids walking without shoes. And what is most scary is that they stop in the middle of the staircase and then do nothing. Nothing more. Well, I'm so scared at that moment that I'm hiding under the blanket and trying to fall asleep very fast because I'm downstairs totally alone. But what was the second scariest thing? The next morning, my grandparents asked me what I was doing at midnight on the staircase, and they both woke up because they heard some steps but saw nobody. Well, it's not the first weird thing I've witnessed there, so I am starting to believe that we have a very scary cottage. In my hometown, next to my high school, is a First Assembly of God church that used to hold a youth event every Monday evening. The church building is separated from their gymnasium by a parking lot. Back in 2006, I used to hang out with my friends there after the Monday event. One of my friends, Daniel, was part of the church, and the people in charge would let us come in and play Halo, under the condition we would be respectful and lock up after. Eventually, we moved our Halo nights to the gym, as they felt it was more secure to lock the church. We'd play until 2 to 3 a.m., and there were usually about 10 of us. One night, after a few rounds, I went outside to get some fresh air. I was accompanied by my friend Weston and Cynthia, the younger sister of another friend, Jessie. Cynthia and I chilled on my car's hood while Weston sat in front of us on the curb. This was around 2:30 a.m. As we're talking, I don't know why, but something made me look to my right, where the church building was. Above the roof, I saw what I can only describe as a bright blue flare. It reminded me of Navi from Ocarina of Time, the way it glowed and had a tail. It was big and was zigzagging down towards the church. Before I could say anything, Cynthia asked, "Did you see that?" This confirmed that I was not just seeing things. The three of us walked over to the opposite side of the church, where there was a ladder that gave you roof access. We both really wanted to see what landed there, and Weston wanted to know what we saw. When we saw that the ladder had a gate in front of it, we gave up, and at that time, Weston got a call. Jesse asked where we were and then said that it was time for Cynthia and him to go home. As we're coming back to the parking lot, Jesse is coming out of the church building. We tell him our story and why we were on the other side. Jesse freaked out and said he saw a bright blue light as well when he exited the gym and was looking for us. Facing the gym on the side of the church was a door with a small window on it. When he looked at it, he saw a bright blue light come to the window, back down the hallway, and turn down another hallway. Thinking it was us using a little flashlight I had on my keychain at the time, he headed inside to find us. At this time, the rest of our group was finished and heading outside. We all start telling them our stories, and Daniel interrupts Jesse and asks, "Wait, you were inside the church? It's supposed to be locked." We then went to the same door Jesse went into, and sure enough, it was unlocked. But not only that, every single door of the church was unlocked, including the double doors in the front. We all started to freak out, and Daniel had to notify the youth ministers of what happened. He had his key with them and relocked the doors. We never figured out what we saw, but I feel confident enough in this since I was not the only one who saw it, and the doors unlocking only added to this. We played a few more times after that until I left for college, but I'll never forget that freaky night. My family moved into a condo my freshman year of high school. It was a newish development in the rural part of town. The first month or so went smoothly, but after a while, my parents started talking about weird stuff that was happening around the house. The lights and the fixtures would stop working all of a sudden, even if my dad had just replaced them. Upon further inspection, they found out the lights had actually been unscrewed and left loose inside the fixture. And these were those lights on the ceiling that kind of look like a boob, so it's semi-labor intensive to reach the actual bulb. A few more months went by, and they were mostly uneventful. Then my mom moved into my bedroom. She had been sleeping on an air mattress, and one of the first nights she claimed that she woke up at 3 a.m. to the feeling of someone sitting on the end of the bed. Another night, she woke up feeling like someone was trying to pull the blanket off of her from the foot of the bed. A couple weeks later, she woke up to the sound of the window shade hitting the wall as if someone had lifted it up above their heads and let it drop back down. The next night, she double-checked to see if the windows were closed and locked, and they were. She woke up to the sound of the shades again and the bedroom door slamming shut. I was kind of skeptical about all these stories just because I never woke up to any of them, but I sleep like a rock and the house gave me weird vibes anyway, so I kept an open mind. Then one night, after my mom had officially abandoned my room, I woke up around 3 to 4 a.m. with sleep paralysis. It was the first time it had ever happened to me, so I didn't know what was going on. I was too busy panicking to look around the room. When I finally calmed down, I noticed this shadow at the foot of my bed. It was the distinct outline of a tall, thin man with a wide brim hat. I just kind of looked at him for a while, trying to process what was in front of me, and he didn't really move, he just stood there and looked back. I eventually closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. In the morning, I told my mom what happened, and she pretty much immediately scheduled an appointment with a medium. To make a long story short, the woman ended up telling us that the man I saw was a farmer who owned the land we lived on, and he was pissed that a bunch of strangers were squatting on his property. So I guess he was trying to spook people into leaving. I never knew any of the neighbors, but I wonder if they had to deal with the same shenanigans. My good friend shared this story with me, and I've never been able to shake it. He's about 40 and divorced. Back when he was married with a 1-year-old daughter, he and his wife bought a house and moved in. It was apparently an old house that needed some fixing up, but they got a good deal and were ready for the work. After a week or so, he notices a life-size doll in the corner of the nursery where his daughter sleeps. It creeps him out because he's a normal human being, so he turns it around to face the corner so it stops staring at him. After putting the kid to bed, he goes downstairs and asks his wife about it. "Where did we get that doll?" She looks at him and says, "I don't remember, I assume someone gave it to you for our daughter, and we moved it here." He's a little weirded out because he doesn't remember moving the doll and wonders if maybe it was in the house when they moved in and he didn't notice it. The next morning, he goes to get the kid out of her crib and notices something. The doll isn't facing the corner anymore. It's looking at him again. I'm getting shivers already just thinking about him telling me this. That's enough to creep anyone out, so he throws it in the closet and shuts the door. That night, he has an argument with his wife. I don't remember what it was about, and it's not really relevant, but the point is that they were getting into it a bit, loud and focused enough that they didn't notice their daughter crying upstairs. At a lull in the argument, his wife hears her and says she's going to go check on her, but he just tells her she'll be fine. Let's hash this out. Another minute goes by, and suddenly he realizes he's practically having to shout over the noise of his daughter screaming from her room. It sounds different. It's not a normal cry. He glances at his wife and quickly starts up the stairs. What he saw when he opened the door literally makes my eyes water with fear when I think about it. The closet door is open. The life-size doll is sitting next to the crib, motionless. And its arms are reaching through the bars towards his daughter. Just stiff and motionless, like it was caught in the act before returning to a doll state. Needless to say, the doll was thrown out and, I believe, even burned. There's no explanation for that other than something seriously demonic. Let me start off by saying that I consider myself a rational person and a skeptic. I don't believe in ghosts, demons, etc. That being said, I don't know how to explain what I witnessed about 10 years ago. I was on a train heading upstate, sitting by the window, listening to music. Suddenly the doors that separate the train cars slide open, and in steps maybe the strangest looking man I've ever seen. I can't really describe it well, his face was just very angular and strange, like a real-life caricature. He also looked homeless and had an unbearable stench that filled the entire train car. He wore dirty but bright, colorful clothes and what looked like a tutu or skirt thing. The whole thing was just strange, but I didn't pay much attention because I've seen much stranger things. So he's working his way down the aisle, and I'm holding my breath until he reaches the other end of the car and proceeds to the next one. Here's the part that still messes with me to this day, it happened again. I don't mean he went back in the other direction. I mean, this guy came back into our train car from the way he originally came in. This is a single-deck train with one aisle, and there was no way I wouldn't have noticed him coming past me again. Just no way. My mind is racing, and I'm kind of freaking out. Did this guy somehow climb on top of the train, Mission Impossible style, and come back in? No, that's crazy, I thought. But I had no explanation. I was mystified. It was pure deja vu, except it happened right before my eyes. The interesting thing is that almost everyone else on that train car seemed to acknowledge that something astonishing and strange had just taken place. I don't know why I didn't yell, "Did you guys just see that, or am I crazy?" No one said anything, but we all sort of looked at each other with these puzzled looks on our faces. I still think about what happened all the time, and I've never been able to rationally explain it. In the old town of Wheat, Tennessee, now a part of Oak Ridge, there is an old white church, the George Jones Memorial Baptist Church. The church was abandoned, along with the rest of the town, in preparation for the Manhattan Project. The church still stands as a historical site today. As the stories go, the basement was a hotbed for ritualistic activity. There have been multiple accounts of people messing around on the grounds and having spirits follow them home. A friend of a friend claims to have gone there and then gone home, only to have his bedroom closet door slam open that night. I planned a trip with my girlfriend about a year ago. We love checking out abandoned locations like that. Not sure what to expect, we parked in front of a gate on a gravel drive leading up to the church. We walked around the gate, ignoring the keep out signs. It was late at night, so we figured we'd be undisturbed. Using our flashlights, we walked along the path until we saw the church and graveyard in the distance, lit by a single streetlight. Upon getting to the church, we see that the door is boarded and locked with a padlock protected by some welded sheet metal to prevent the lock from being cut. Walking around the building, we saw the tall windows were boarded up about 3/4 of the way, so we could not see anything but the ceiling inside. The back door, leading to the basement, was also boarded up from the inside, apparently preventing any entry that way. We resigned ourselves to spending some time in the graveyard. We walked through, reading the headstones and taking pictures. Nothing was really out of the ordinary except that in one of the pictures there was a weird shadow in front of one of the headstones, but that could have just been a lens thing. What really freaked us out was that we heard footsteps on the gravel pathway. We were sure we'd been caught and were going to get into some kind of trouble for trespassing. We decided to try and get back to the car. On the way, there was a large limb fall out of a tree some 30 feet away. Maybe it was a coincidence. Since the area was pretty heavily wooded, the path was our best bet to get back, so we resigned ourselves to taking it to get back to the car. The strangest thing of the entire visit was that we clearly heard footsteps on the gravel but did not see anyone on the way back to the car. I'll be going back with a method of removing the padlock so that we can check out the inside of the church at some point. It's just too enticing to leave alone. I moved into a basement apartment and lived there for 2 years to save money. After a week or so, I kept waking up at night around 3 a.m., and immediately my eyes would zoom into a corner of the room for no discernible reason, and the nightmare started. I would dream of the corner of the room, and I started seeing something demonic and terrifying crouched in that corner as it leered at me. I would wake up screaming and could not tell reality apart from my dream. I started always sleeping with a nightlight on. Slowly, I started sleeping more and more when I was home, but whenever I was out of the house, I was totally energetic and able to focus, but as soon as I came inside the house, specifically my bedroom, I and others would suddenly become lethargic, depressed, and unproductive. I never told anyone what I was experiencing, but people who visited me would tell me they would get a bad feeling in my room. Even people who didn't believe in paranormal stuff would say that. I wondered if it was carbon monoxide poisoning, but the sensor never went off. After a few more months, I started waking up in the middle of the night for no reason and having this strong feeling that someone was watching me. Around this time, my recurring nightmares of the demonic being changed to a recurring and pleasant dream of a nice-looking young man in a dark suit who I'd never seen before in real life and whose face did not look familiar to me from TV or something. He would usually be standing very far away from where I was standing. He would smile gently at me and wave me over to him, and I would start walking towards him. However, I never actually reached him and would wake up before I got within arm's reach of him. I just chalked all of this stuff up to stress disturbing my sleep and my dreams being weird manifestations of my stress. But then I started babysitting my friend's 2-year-old daughter, and that is when I started getting kind of freaked out. One night, the baby and I were laying on my bed as we waited for her mom to come pick her up when suddenly she turned to the corner and started giggling. Then she started saying hi. Very excitedly and waving. I was creeped out, but I figured it was just her being a kid and having a wild imagination. I peeked over and saw nothing in the corner, turned my back to it again, and faced the baby and watched her. She was legit smiling, laughing as if someone was making a funny face at her, and waving to the corner of the room. Then my heart dropped when she started babbling as if having a conversation with someone, all the while she was staring at something in the corner. At this point, I picked her up and took her out of my room because I was so freaked out. As I carried her out, she started saying bye to whatever was there. After this incident, whenever I would wake up with the feeling of being watched, I started seeing a shadowy shape a few feet away from me. As the weeks went on, the shape felt like it was getting more opaque and taking on the form of a silhouette of a man. My first thought was that I was hallucinating and freaking myself out. Yet I kept seeing this shadowy outline, no matter what I told myself. I was terrified, no matter how logically I tried to approach the situation. The little girl I babysat would still come over and occasionally say hi to random areas of the room, and whenever she heard a noise like a creak, if she happened to be in my room, she would always immediately look over to the corner of the room. I just tried to be logical about it, but it still freaked me out when she would do that. Then one night, I was having my usual pleasant dream of the strange man who would wave me over. This time, as I was walking over to him, something felt off, and right as I was within arm's reach of him, something screamed at me to stop, and when I looked at his face, it morphed into something so utterly horrific and demonic that I woke up screaming. Again, I saw the shadowy form standing a few feet away from me, and I could feel it staring at me. I was utterly terrified, but my mind was telling me it was just a dream or remnants of a sleep paralysis experience, but my body was pumped full of adrenaline and so taut as if I were being hunted. It's a strange thing when your mind and body are at complete odds with each other. At this point, I was terrified I was losing my mind and maybe experiencing some early symptoms of a mental breakdown or illness like schizophrenia or something. I had to have been hallucinating, and I even considered going to a therapist. I was terrified to go to sleep at night and started keeping all the lights on all the time. In any case, a few weeks later, I made up my mind that I needed to move the duck out of that place after the little girl, who was now 3 years old, suddenly walked into my bedroom and started crying in fear for no reason. After that, whenever she heard noises, she would start whimpering in fear as she clutched at me and refused to go into my room. A few months after this, I moved the duck out, and I could not believe how different the first night at my new apartment felt. A few months later, I talked to the landlady of the basement apartment I had moved out of. She was a family friend, and suddenly confessed to her about all this stuff I had been experiencing in the place she had rented out to me. It was the first time she had ever heard any of it, and she started telling me it must have been my imagination. The landlady's daughter was there with us, and that is when we were both shocked as her daughter told us that apparently she was friends with the previous tenant, and the lady was super into the occult and wanted to be a witch. The previous tenant would regularly hold seances to communicate with the dead and regularly use Ouija boards to communicate with the other world. The lady would also have magical rituals to call on spirits to help her with whatever she needed help with. I was just shocked into silence. Last I heard, the landlady put a few Bibles and crosses in the apartment and burned sage in there. Anyways, I've never felt that kind of dread since I left that place. Never have those freaky dreams again. I never dreamt of that man in the dark suit again, who would beckon me to him. I never saw a shadowy figure again looming near me as it watched me sleep. I've never had the feeling I was being watched since I left. I am sure there's a rational and logical explanation to it all, but I just will never forget that sense of dread and primal fear and the dark feeling that something was trying to crawl and claw its way into my mind that I would get while living in that place.